Hey, checking in again with Travels in West Africa by Mary Henrietta Manley, who is talking about trade and labor in West Africa in chapter 21 here, where again it is more sort of how we should use, using waterways is the way to go. That the railways would be like a lot more expensive. That roads are not actually going to do stuff, which is all kind of you know, how can we better colonize? I do think it's kind of interesting there at the end where they liken it to America, where, oh, well, there's a lot more colonists there. And, that that Mr. Elliott says in America, the surplus population of Europe and the markets in the eastern states have made railway development profitable on the whole. But in Africa, until pioneer work has been done and the prospects of colonization and plantation are sufficiently definite and settled to induce colonists to go out in considerable numbers, it will be ruinous to build a long railway line. So that's one of these things of like, oh, yeah, that never actually happened. They extracted a whole bunch of resources, but Africa never became a place, thankfully, where it was flooded by European. At least not this part. The majority of Africa. It was not flooded with immigrants, except for South Africa, where there was a large enough of a white Dutch and British population there that shoved out sufficient numbers that had sufficient numbers to become a minority ruling class that, to its shame, hung on for a hunk of a time. Still white South Africans now there, but are now living in a different kind of a different regime because it's still majority of black people who live there who would like to kind of run their own country. The country that they've lived, that they and generations upon generations upon generations upon generations upon generations have lived there. But it's just like one of these, like, oh, a railway won't work now, not until we colonize. Which, that is interesting. That is interesting in itself, just as a mind frame of course we're taking, of course we're exploiting, and of course, the logical thing is we're going to colonize here as well, send our people here, and what the kind of the unspoken question is, like, what's going to happen to all the black people who are here? They'll be under our rule, and will they go the way of the native peoples of North America, which there was a very concerted effort to entirely wipe out. Now, I mean, I guess the big things in Africa is, well, the population in Africa, which is probably far denser than the population in North America, also were seemed didn't get wiped out by the massive plagues that were brought over from Europe, and indeed, the people who came to Africa were very vulnerable to dying from all the diseases that were already in Africa, so that it became one of these places like you went to and then you perhaps died, as the author of this book ends up dying not too many years later after she's written and published this book. She dies of disease there. That seems to have been the usual thing that's happened to people who've tried to thrust themselves into Africa. So yeah. But this I'm now definitely I've started my 1901 project, and I would count this book as a part of the 1901 project, and it's very much still got the idea of the capitalism of how we're going to exploit. That's not to say that the exploitation of the planet and of peoples around the world stopped at this point, but this is still like, oh, we're still in the act of, like, oh, we could colonize here. At least someone here is thinking that. I don't know if the powers that be were actually thinking about that. I think they were maybe still, they're thinking much more about extracting goods, but not wanting to take over these places. I don't know. That's a good question to ask. I mean, they were establishing governmental controls here, very much like what the British were doing in India. Would be interesting to look at what they were doing during this time in India, in Africa, in various parts of the world. The British Empire was still running, not to the full strength of what it had been. That was probably earlier in the 19th century. This is the very end of the 19th century, coming into the 20th century, where it was before things change. Things change. So that's part of where I want to be at going forward and examining stuff. Oh boy, colonialism, the death knells of colonialism, the starts of post-colonialism, but also what replaces it isn't necessarily a utopia either. Very much so. Very much so. All right, I'll leave it there. More videos later.